We are recording the interview of Richard Hughes. This interview is being conducted by David Berry from the Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University's new media incubator in Dayton, Ohio. It is 4:30 p.m. on October 19th, 2017. So why don't we begin with where and when were you born?
I was born in 1966 in Youngstown, Ohio, northeastern Ohio. My folks had moved there from another part of northeastern Ohio. My father was a veteran who had served in the Second World War, came back and was a small businessman, ran a brake and front end alignment shop in northeastern Ohio, and he had married my mother, who's from Girard, Ohio, which is a town up in the northeast, a suburb of Youngstown. And that's where we lived up until the time I went off to university.
What did your father do in the military?
My father was a sergeant in the 61st Engineering Battalion in the European Theater of Operations. He had graduated from high school in a small town called McDonald, Ohio, which is a steel town, what they call a company town. At the turn of the last century, when the steel process began to be more, manufacturing became more automated, more labor intensive, they opened up a steel mill in what they call the Steel Valley, which runs from down in Campbell, Ohio, through Youngstown, Girard, Niles, Warren, all the way up. They call it the Steel Valley. They call it the Ruhr Valley of America. And so my father worked in the steel mill for a while until he became of age, and then enlisted in the United States Army. And so he went from McDonald, Ohio, up to Camp Perry in Ohio with a bunch of his pals who had enlisted. His younger brother had also enlisted in the Navy. They actually, my uncle actually left high school to go join because there were 7 kids, and they'd all grown up during the Depression. So my father went off, went from Camp Perry, went to Georgia, and then eventually over to England, and then participated in the liberation of Europe, returning back to Ohio in 1945. Actually, no, I'm sorry, early 1946, returned back in Ohio, sought his adventures and his fortune out in California. That lasted about 8 months, because a lot of veterans went back to California seeking gold and fame and fortune. And then he returned to Ohio and then ran a small business from there.
What about any siblings?
I have an older sister who's 9 years older than I am. She's also from northeastern Ohio, a career school teacher. She had gone to Youngstown State University and was there a little bit before I was, so she got to deal with some of my father's angst a little bit over the war. My uncle, the one that served with my father in the Second World War, did not have any issues. A younger uncle, brother of my father and one of my other uncles, he had served in Korea, and he had served in some of the bitter fighting in Korea. So he had lived with some of the challenges that veterans have lived with ever since. Peloponnesian Wars, of coming back, trying to readjust. And he died an earlier death that was substance related due to alcohol and whatnot. But he had died, sugar, right when I came in the service. But my father and my mother pretty much lived what we would call probably the standard American post-Second World War dream. Come back from the war, surviving it, be a good businessman, citizen, churchgoer, build a nice little Cape Cod type style house, and just go back to work. My father was impressed and a little angered with what he saw in Europe. Impressed with, a young boy from northeastern Ohio gets to go over and see parts that you only read about in high school at that time, and then also the fact that you see the the inhumanity towards other men, because they had helped liberate some of the concentration camps, and that made my father, as well as a lot of veterans in the ETO, very, very angry. So he came back with a little bit of anger about that, and he never spoke about it until when I was in high school in the early 1980s. He very rarely talked about it, nor did my Uncle Donald from the Pacific. They didn't really talk about those type of things. But like a lot of veterans, you come back, go get back to living in the real world, and do what you can, having survived. So.
How did that look like through the eye when you were younger, seeing your father and uncle go through?
Well, again, it wasn't rampant. It was just one of those things where when he'd watch a movie or something, he'd say, well, I've been there. Oh, I've been to Paris. Well, when were you in Paris? And that would generate a story. It wasn't like a raging anger or anything like that. It was just almost like a moment of reflection where you'd see it had happened 40 years earlier, where you could see that he would reflect that, like it was almost like being back right there. And the passage of time, which all humans kind of lament, it goes by quickly. And we think about how long a day is or a week or a year, but it really goes by really quickly. And he could relay about the story he always tells of he had landed in France on like D+6 or 7. But he had said, the night before the invasion, 2 nights before the invasion, because it was called off on the 5th, they had them all getting all their gear, and the GIs would have to wear all their gear, but they'd also have to wear like anti-chemical warfare gear, which these charcoal line things, and have to wear all their gear and all their uniform except for their pack and whatnot and their weapon. And then they have to lay there in the camp and whatnot. And my father never really liked doing that, he said. So he's like, that's enough of this garbage. So he stripped down to his skivvies and his T-shirt. And sure enough, he said the night that he does that, and finally he's getting a good night of sleep for the first night in weeks, it's the night of the invasion, and everyone was pretty much on alert. But he told stories of being in England and seeing the bombers come back and the fighters and during the daylight bombing raids and all that. And he talked about that experience, how he hates tea and hates marmalade because all they would serve is orange marmalade and tea. But it was just really weird because it was kind of inspiring because as you grow up and you read more about history, you realize, when you're young, you don't really think about it, but by the time you're about like 8 or 9, you realize, holy cow, this was a really, really big thing. And if you take a liking to history, or if you want to study more of it, you find out that, wow, there are some really big events that, holy cow, preceded my presence on this planet. And when I was kind of proud that my father was a part of that. He was in some social organizations in northeastern Ohio, like the Fraternity of Eagles and the Elks Association, and doing things with the church and whatnot. But you never saw him, go like to the VFW hall or be a part of the American Legion or whatnot. But it's really interesting and inspiring because you see there's so much about this person that I don't know. There's so much that he experienced at the age of 18, 19, and 20 that when you think of your parents, you don't think, wow, were they young and cool at one point? Well, yeah, a lot of times they were. And that was kind of interesting. So it inspired my study of history and whatnot. In 3rd grade, I did a book report on the American Volunteer Group, also known as the Flying Tigers, and Claire Lee Chenault. And one of the cool things I got to do later in life is you read about the guys and gals, or guys primarily, from the Army Air Corps and the Navy and the Marine Corps who left and kind of sort of in violation of U.S. neutrality went to China to fight with Claire Lee Chenault. Years later, when I was an active duty member, I got to meet some of these people. Like, holy cow, I got to meet David Lee Tex Hill, who served in the Navy and then served with the Flying Tigers, and then when America came to the war in the China-Burma-India theater. You get to meet all those people. But my father's service kind of inspired me to study more history and political science and whatnot, and it just made me want to learn more about the world and go see it.
So you mentioned you had gone to university. Is that what you were doing before you enlisted?
Yes, I had left Girard, Ohio, and I wanted to go be an aerospace engineer, and I went to Ohio State University and found out that engineering is not really my suit at that time. Had I known what I know now, I would have taken a lot more science and math. So I transferred to political science. So I lived in Columbus, Ohio from 1984 through about 1989. While in Columbus, I had a part-time job working at the state legislature. So I'd work as a Senate page, which is like an administrative assistant for state senators in the state legislature. And so you'd go fetch some legislation, or you'd go run errands for the state senator, and you'd sit when the state legislature was in session, you'd sit there nearby the guy or gal who was your state senator, and if they needed something, hey, go down to the law library and get me a copy of this this House version of this Ohio Senate bill, and do those type of things. So I did that, wearing business attire and whatnot during the day, during the mornings, and in the evenings, afternoons, I go home and change into standard student fare and go to classes. So I was kind of working my way through university a bit. And then also after I graduated, you know, I really should have gone through ROTC or should have enlisted in the Ohio Air or Army National Guard, but I really didn't think about those things till I was too far gone to go do that. I was too far in college, in university to do that. So what I did do is I worked in the governor's office in the state of Ohio for a year, just doing legislative assistant, administrative assistant type stuff, working with the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate and some of my former colleagues while I applied to go to officer training school. And then I applied and got accepted to go to officer training school, and then it wasn't long before I was doing lots of push-ups in the Texas sand in lovely San Antonio, Texas at funky Camp Medina, the Medina Training Annex, just west-southwest of Blackland Air Force Base, Texas, in San Antonio. And so then I went to officer training school and got yelled at by some really large, burly, big sergeants, and trained by some interesting officers, who some of whom had some Vietnam experience, most of them who did not, but a few who did. And that was an interesting experience. It was interesting in the fact that it's not only physical, but it's also mental. How can I trust you to, the lives of our airmen and soldiers if your shoes aren't double tied and tucked in? And to this day, sugar, 28 years later, when I'm wearing shoes, whether they're tennis shoes or boots, my shoes are double tied and tucked in. It's just a habit of training, I guess. So I fold things a certain way, and like the rituals you all go through: getting yelled at, getting your your hair cut off, never having enough time to get what you need done. But it does set that prioritization and whatnot. So that's where I went to officer training school. Then I got commissioned in December of 1989.
Now you said Air Force Base and Airmen, so I'm going to use the context clues and guess that you joined the Air Force?
Yes, I was in the United States Air Force.
Okay. And what made you choose the Air Force over the Army or Navy?
Well, one, I'd always had love for aviation. Part of it was due to my father's experience when he said, "Oh, you don't want to be in the Air Corps," but I always loved aviation and flying and space exploration. As a young boy, 3-4 years old, I can still remember some of the later Apollo 15, Apollo 16, or Apollo 14, Apollo 15 moonshots. It used to be a big thing on television with the big Saturn V rocket, and they'd launch it. My grandparents have lived down near Cocoa Beach, Florida, so I'd get to go to Cape Canaveral and Cape Kennedy and see all that. So I'd always loved aviation, and I loved maritime as well, but I hadn't really thought about the Marine Corps. And I knew the Army had helicopters and a little bit of fixed wing, but I always thought about being something related to aviation. And I figured, well, okay, then all the services have their aviation parts, but the one service that had the overwhelming majority of aviation was the United States Air Force, versus the air components of the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the aviation, helicopter, rotary wing aviation in the Army. So that kind of drew me to that. The one Navy recruiter did want me to go be a surface warfare officer, but the thought of just being hazed gray and underway and didn't really appeal to me that much. So I went towards the Air Force. Now, in retrospect, any service would have been fantastic to serve in. I had some friends who had been in the Navy, and our maritime friends are great, but the Navy's at sea. There's not a lot to do at sea except train, drill, and maneuver. And so I wanted to see the world, but not 12 knots at a time. So then that kind of led me to the Air Force.
So after you got your commission, what were you trained to be?
Well, I was trained to be a command and control officer, a combination of, think of like a communications officer that dealt with the direction of aircraft and systems. And so I actually had an initial assignment to what was then the 43rd Bombardment Wing in Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. And I always wanted to go out to the Pacific because the Guam is, in relative terms, close to Australia, and what, red-blooded American doesn't want to go to Australia. However, when I was at my technical training at Keesler Air Force Base in lovely Biloxi, Mississippi, I got a new set of orders. It was right as the Cold War was about to end, so in light of budget and fiscal realities, as well as the requirement that you didn't need as many bombers or tanks or carriers, etc. The drawdown that had already started with the first with George H.W. Bush administration, they canceled those orders, and I had gone in the hole with advance leave a whole bunch because I figured I'm going to be on the other side of the world, knee deep in Australian hospitality, and I wouldn't be coming back to the land of the big PX for a while. However, they amended my orders and sent me from the 43rd Bombardment Wing, which was closing, which is a B-52 Stratofortress wing, to Plattsburgh, New York, to the 380th Bombardment Wing, which was equipped with FB-111 Aardvarks, which is the strategic bomber version of the General Dynamics F-111 strike fighter, a low-level penetrating strike fighter. So I ended up graduating as an honor graduate in April of 1990, and then being stationed at Plattsburgh Air Force Base, New York, about 15 miles from the Canadian border and about 45 minutes south of Montreal. Plattsburgh was unique in that, aside from the United States Military Academy at West Point, it was the oldest actively manned military installation in the United States ever since the War for Independence. The Battle of Lake Champlain in the 1770s was a turning point for the battle in New York and Battle of Saratoga and whatnot. So it was a unique installation because it was a strategic air command base with bomber aircraft fully loaded with nuclear weapons on alert, and air refueling aircraft, which means you can go places and do things, and also just the location. It was an interesting base with a lot of history, as well as being close to Montreal, Canada, where folks are very friendly and nice, and even if you don't speak French, they understand, and if you make the attempt, they're very hospitable, not as rude as folks would think they would be. And that was my first assignment, and I arrived there in April of 1990 and worked in the 528th Bombardment Squadron, which was equipped with the FB-111. I was the squadron adjutant before I went to be a command control officer. Squadron adjutant is sort of like the guy or gal who's the squadron commander's right-hand person for all the non-flying activities. So the equipment custodian, the money for the budget, the person responsible for every piece of equipment in the squadron, for the training, you ran the training schedule, not only scheduling time in the simulator for the flying training, but also just all the ancillary training. Hey, have you had your chem warfare? Have you had your self-aid buddy care? Are you aware of the law of armed conflict? We also did classified intelligence briefings worked with the intel folks in the wing on scheduling and giving intel briefings on different Soviet air threats and surface-to-air threats, both gun and missile equipped. And so we did that for a while, and I was also the group mobility officer. So if the group or the squadrons in the group had to go somewhere, you were responsible for making sure everyone was up on their training. Did they have the right equipment? Did they have their chem gear? Did they have their personal equipment and their flying kit, their flying gear for deployments? So you know, the air crews for a week at a time lived out at the alert facility, which is a hardened underground facility where it's heavily guarded and whatnot. And the command control side of it is, you know, they broadcast messages every so often with alphanumerics, and they decode to something, and if they decode to certain things, you hit the horn, and the air crew scrambled, and sirens blared, and you know, everyone got real tense, and they run out to the airplanes, just like, you know, the old scramble days, run out to the airplanes, start them up, and get moving, and then you find out, okay, are we really going to global thermonuclear war, or is that always, thank God, it's just an exercise to test readiness and whatnot. So that was the mission there. The group mobility thing played a role in August of 1990, and 2 August of 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded the independent sovereign country of Kuwait, claiming it was more of his provinces, and then that led to Desert Shield and Desert Storm.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of responsibility for your first duty station.
Yes and no. Yes, it was, because you're responsible for a lot of things, but unlike my colleagues from university who were in the Army or the Marines, I didn't have a platoon of folks. I didn't have a flight of airmen. I had 2 NCOs and 2 airmen, and that was it. So from a leadership perspective, you know, there's a lot of responsibility fiscally, you know, sign on the dotted line things, a lot of activities to keep you busy. But when it came actually to the leadership aspect of it, that was a little bit, you know, folks, colleagues of mine in the wing who were in the maintenance squadron or the security police squadron, they had, much like a platoon leader, they had, you know, 30 to 40 airmen, in some cases 70 airmen underneath them they were responsible for, and a master sergeant guiding them. I was blessed in that I had a good master sergeant, and she had been around, and her husband was a chief master sergeant, which is the equivalent of a sergeant major or a master chief petty officer. And they had kind of raised me from being a boot brown bar, second lieutenant, to actually understanding leadership, understanding the enlisted force, taking care of your airmen, you know, almost like the cavalry saying horse before the troops, troops before the officers. And they instilled that for me, and that was really the lessons I learned there. And also the bomber squadron itself was a bunch of selectively picked guys. And the air refueling squadron was a bunch of selectively picked guys and gals to be in those units because of the importance of the strategic deterrent mission. And so it was really unique being around a bunch of, you know, a bunch of stallions, if you will, because they're going at the best they can, and they were willing enough to take the time out to train and teach and educate me and mentor me, which is a big thing. So, and that all paid off when the Gulf War kicked off, because then things got a little busy with our wing deployment to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and whatnot.
So what did that look like, kind of coming off the Cold War, Desert Storm, Desert Shield starting up? How did that change your...
It was different in that, you know, the Persian Gulf, which everyone touted as a really close run affair at first, but it really wasn't, in that, you know, 2 August, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and then we sent, our bomber aircraft had to stay in the CONUS, obviously, because they were, although their primary mission was nuclear deterrence and nuclear strike, they were also conventionally capable as well. We sent a whole bunch of our air refueling airplanes. So my colleague, Dale Bruner, he got to go. He was also a squadron adjutant. We were going to swap out, so he got to go, and I spent a lot of time loading airplanes in the pouring rain and working triple shifts and working about 18, 20 hours a day for about 4 or 5 months, from the Desert Shield portion to the Desert Storm portion. And then when it was over, you know, came back, and then it's like, okay, not only is, you know, we were victorious with a coalition of 70 nations and making the bad man leave Kuwait, but it was odd in that it was a new era, because the Cold War is now over. So on 27 September 1991, President Bush authorized the transmission of an emergency action message to all the strategic air command units. It said, effective immediately, take all the bomber aircraft off alert. Take all the Minuteman II ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force, off alert. And at that time, we had 1,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles. So in one fell swoop, you just took 500 of them off alert. For the bombers, immediately returned the special weapons back to the weapons storage areas. For the air refueling aircraft, take them off alert as well. For ballistic missile submarine force, for the theater nuclear weapons employed or utilized by our land components in the Army, all those were going to come home, all those were going to come back. So it was different. It was exciting because after 70 years of communism, which is the worst geopolitical system one can think of. On paper it sounds really great, but it's really not, given human nature and the way people are raised in individual freedoms and whatnot. It was really exciting because you're like, okay, the freedom of, you know, the ideas of individual freedoms and the rights of man, and that excelled over the rights of the state or the government. That was a big, exciting thing. At the same time, folks wondered, okay, what about all this force structure and all the services? At that time, we had, I want to say 13 Army divisions and a bunch of independent brigades and regiments. The Navy was very close to 587 ships, including 41 ballistic missile submarines. The Marine Corps was always about the same size. It was about 180,000 Marines. But the Air Force was, when I entered, was like 700,000 active duty Air Force, not counting the Air National Guard or the Air Force Reserve or the civilians. It was about, was well over 600,000. And so within a year and a half of that, things like, okay, well now there's going to be a reduction in force based on your MOS or your skill set. Maybe we'll need you, maybe we won't. The airlines were hiring, and so a bunch of guys and gals said, well, a bunch of maintenance folks, a bunch of pilot and aircrew folks were like, well, I'll go work for FedEx or the airlines or whatnot. But it was exciting, but a little bit not disconcerting, a little bit odd, because you're wondering, okay, well, all right, we won the Cold War. There were genuine extensions of amiability towards the Russians. You know, the Soviet Union, you know, ceased to exist. It broke up back into independent countries. So there was a little bit of apprehension of, okay, well, the world has changed. Our system and the Western system of freedom prevailed. Okay, well, now what? And gee, we just fought this large conflict in the Middle East. There are sensitive partners there. What's going to happen then? And then it kind of became a little bit odd in that Well, now we're going to stay there for a while. Well, what do you mean for a while? How long's a while? And so that was it. In the mid 1990s was odd because we had all these capabilities that we were developing, future capabilities, and the acquisition and research and development pipeline for everything, every system, whether it's land-based, maritime, space, air, is a pretty long pipeline. Well, if you said all of a sudden your primary adversary and the type of warfare you're planning to go fight is now defunct, gone, obsolete, the ash bin of history, so to speak, as Churchill would have said, well, now what? What do you do with the force structure, with the guys and gals getting out? And there were a variety of things they did for soldiers, airmen, Marines, and sailors getting out. They offered them more educational benefits. They tried to get use them in the job market. But it was odd in that aspect of it. But then also for me personally, it's like, well, okay, if the nuclear command and control, if we don't have bombers on alert, what are things to go see and do? So I cross-trained into missiles and space, intercontinental ballistic missiles and space operations, because they had called the Persian Gulf War the first space war. Originally it wasn't a war in space, but the widespread utilization of global positioning system for precision navigation and timing. The use of Cold War designed satellites that would detect Russian missile launches from 23,000 miles in space, also could detect Scuds and could detect a variety of other things. So there was going to be a growth industry in the Air Force or in the military. It would be in the space domain. So that I kind of cross-trained at about the 5-year mark after I'd done my professional military education. The people of this nation and the Air Force had funded a tuition assistance, so I got a master's degree from Cal State University in history and international relations. I was really excited about that. But then I cross-trained into missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and space operations, where I would spend the next 7 or 8 years of my career doing things related to that. And also personal things had changed. I eventually got married and settled down a little bit and moved. When I moved from Plattsburgh, I'd been stationed out at Castle Air Force Base in California when the Cold War ended, which was a B-52 and Stratofortress bomber, KC-135 Stratotanker air refueling plane, training wing. Well, that activity ramped down a bit. We didn't need guys and gals to fly as many buffs and tankers as we did. So that's when I had cross-trained in the Central Valley of California. I was at Castle Air Force Base, the 93rd Bombardment Wing. And that was a unique place because being in California at that time, it was still a lot more populous than it had been in the 30s, but after the Second World War, a lot of folks moved there. But in the early 90s, it was an interesting place to be because it was crowded, but not as crowded as it would be less than 10 years later. You could still get to places. You could still drive in Yosemite National Park. You could drive your private vehicle there. I don't think they don't let you do that anymore. In the late 90s, they surely wouldn't let you do that. So you get to go and see some interesting things and do some fun things. When I was at Plattsburgh, we did joint exercise with the Navy, so I got to go land aboard an aircraft carrier and spend 2 or 3 days at sea, which confirmed my decision not to join the naval service because it was nice and exciting, but I could not see it being nice and exciting for 6 months at a time. So at that point, I had cross-trained into missiles and space, and even though we had taken our bomber force off nuclear alert, we had removed weapons from Europe as part of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We still had the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles and Peacekeeper missiles on alert, and we still had a fleet ballistic missile force that went out and patrolled at sea, always ready to, in case something would go wrong. But even that force got shrunk in size from 41 ballistic missile submarines down to 14. And there were newer submarines of the Ohio class, which made a difference. But anyway, so I cross-trained in missiles and space, went to missile training and space training at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, which is near Santa Maria. It's about an hour north of Santa Barbara. The United States government owns 37 miles of pristine beachfront that you can't swim on because the riptides and the sharks are vicious, and it's also a protected area for a variety of species, so you really can't go to the beach. You can go to the beach, but you can only walk on certain areas and whatnot. So I spent 6.5 months in training there, and then went to Montana to the 341st Missile Wing, where I was an intercontinental ballistic missile launch officer, and did that for about 3 or 4 years.
So what did that look like, being a ballistics launch
A ballistic missile officer? Well, at the end of the Cold War, we had 6 strategic missile wings spread throughout the northern plains of the United States. Places like Ellsworth, South Dakota, and Minot, North Dakota, Grand Forks, North Dakota, Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, and Francis C. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. But it was different in that the Cold War was over, but our country, our nation, didn't want to necessarily get rid of all nuclear weapons because there's still bad actors out there. So it was interesting in that you trained for a Cold War mission that you pray you never had to do, but you still train nevertheless, because with the release or withhold of nuclear weapons, there's no room for incomplete knowledge of substandard performance, which is a briefing you always had to give. And so it was interesting in that the missiles are spread out by themselves over thousands of square miles. So it was a little bit different. It was nice being newly married. It was nice that I would be out in the field for 8 to 9 nights a month. And we lived on post, on base. And my wife was a businesswoman, so she could work in Great Falls, Montana, and I could live at the base, and we'd go out 8, 9 times a month. And so basically it was interesting that if you're going out on alert, you show up to your squadron area, almost like, and you go through some briefings, and you get all together, because there's 20 launch control centers with the 2-person crew in each of them. And then there's at that time 200 missiles. Each launch control center had primary responsibility for 10, but all responsible for all 50 in the squadron. So basically, there were 4 missile squadrons. They had 5 launch control centers, which were underground, anywhere from 80 to 100, or 60 to 120 feet. And above them, there's these little ranch houses called alert facilities. And up there, you have security police, security forces, which are sort of like the Air Force Light Infantry. They're responsible for protecting airfields and critical areas. And they would go patrol, not too different like an Army or a Marine infantry unit. They had vehicles, and they go patrol, because all these launch facilities, all these missiles are out by themselves. They're remotely monitored, and you can tell if something's going on out there. But if you get an indication, you call upstairs, and the cops would arm up and go out there, because they're pretty heavily armed. But anyway, so you'd show up at your squadron, get another briefing with all 20 crews, crew being 2 people, and then you'd hop in your vehicle and drive out. My squadron was the 490th Missile Squadron, which is still in existence. It's our closest site. So you drive to work on a Montana highway, which is actually a 2-lane road, paved 2-lane road. And you drive, our closest site was 93 miles from the base. So you get all your briefings and all your materials and whatnot. And if you're taking out a crew chief, a facility manager, or a cook for the site, they might be going with you. But usually it'd be just a crew of 2 guys or gals. And you drive for an hour and a half, 2 hours to get out there. You have to go through some security procedures, and are you say who you say you are. And if you ever screwed anything up, one little minor thing, you'd get jacked up. Jacked up consists of some young security forces member all hopped up on caffeine and reality television, with their M16A2 with 180 rounds of ball ammunition, ball and tracer ammunition. And you'd have to authenticate in certain ways to say certain things. Otherwise, they'd perforate you like Swiss cheese. Given the mission of operating, maintaining, securing nuclear weapons. So you had to get very keen to attention to detail and whatnot. So you go out on alert, say the magic words, and get on board the site. You go downstairs behind the 8-ton blast door in this launch control center. It was designed in the 1960s and implemented in the 1960s. And you'd relieve the crew. They'd go, who had been out there for 24, 28 hours. You safety brief them, call upstairs to make sure everything was okay upstairs, send them on their way, give them a safety briefing. They'd drive back an hour and a half to 2 hours back to the main base, and then you'd be there for 24 hours with a fellow crew member, decoding messages, doing procedures. If they had to replace a warhead on a nuclear missile, that's a big thing, because you have to roll the door and do a variety of things. But you're responsible for everything that goes on in that 7,000 to 8,000 square part of Montana. So all the maintenance, all the security, you're the lieutenant or captain in charge of that part of the world for right then. And so that was a bit intense. At the same time, it was interesting, because you're doing a very critical mission that very few Americans know about, even to this day. Now more so, there's some more scholarship, there's more interviews and whatnot on how 22 and 23-year-olds, both topside 18 to 23-year-olds, young sergeants, young airmen up there securing and operating and maintaining those weapons. And then you have 2 lieutenants, or a lieutenant and a captain, 120 feet below, in charge of all these weapons. Should the president ever, he or she ever decide to execute those, you had to be ready all the time. And it was kind of stressful at the time, but in that early to mid-1990s, you knew that, okay, the Cold War's pretty much over. There's a very low probability of this happening, but you still had to be ready for it to happen. So I'd done that for about 4.5 years and did instructor positions and whatnot. And we left Montana in early 2000. I had wanted to go, I was coming up on my majors promotion board, and we wanted to go to DC before we had kids, but then ended up going to, because they want you to do a joint tour. Certain level of being a senior NCO or when you're just about to finish being a company grade officer, they always want you to do a joint tour. And that, in retrospect, is because of the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act, which said the services can't fight alone. We had run into a variety of situations in the 1980s during the Cold War where services would not talk to one another due to pride, arrogance, stupidity, and whatnot. So you see it in the movie, but it's Heartbreak Ridge, but it's actually the young paratrooper. It wasn't a Marine. It was a paratrooper during the invasion of Grenada, Operation Just Fury, where he actually calls back with a credit card phone to Fort Bragg to get naval gunfire support for his embattled platoon. That and a variety of other things caused the Air Force, the services, to do joint. So they wanted to get a joint tour, working with other services, understanding their capabilities, their limitations, how they presented forces, forced to work together in both geographic and functional ways. So I was up for a joint tour. They sent me to United States Space Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is headquartered in Peterson Air Force Base. United States Space Command being the Joint Combatant Command responsible directly to the Secretary and the President for all space operations. Both Air Force space operations was about 80–85% of space operations, Army space operations, because you have Army space operators, naval space, and at that time there were not very many Marines involved with space operations, and that being detection of ballistic missile launches from space and from ground-based sensors. Satellite command and control, basically flying a satellite, because a satellite is in Mother Earth's orbit, and over time the gravity will try and suck it back in. So you have to make sure the information that the satellite is processing, the job it's doing, whether it's communications or warning or surveillance and reconnaissance, intelligence type stuff. You want to make sure it does the job, but also is it where it needs to be as it's continuously in orbit around the Earth. Space launch and space lift, where you're actually putting satellites and things up in space. So that was the joint command for that. And then North American Aerospace Defense Command was a binational command with our friends in Canada, and it was geared towards the defense and protection of North America. So any airspace or missile threat that would come in, that you detect, or anything that would come to North America, our treaty with the Canadians that we'd help each other out in a mutual defense treaty since 1958, 57, 58. So it was interesting because you work not only in a joint environment with airmen, soldiers, Marines, and sailors, but you also worked with folks from the Royal Canadian Air Force, Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Army. And that was good because you forged some really good friendships and some good experiences with those folks. In addition, instead of working at Peterson Air Force Base, where the headquarters of Army Space Command was and Air Force Space Command, the individual service components to U.S. Space Command, I worked in Cheyenne Mountain, which was inside a mountain down by Fort Carson in the south end of Colorado Springs. And that's where you had, you went inside a mountain, that's where you had the command center, and you had the Space Surveillance Center and the Missile Warning Center, where I was the chief of the Missile Warning Center. You had the Communication Center and the command directors and whatnot. And so in times of crisis, I mean, those centers were always 24/7 manned and operated. But in times of crisis, you would shut the blast doors, and it was pretty well hardened. Being inside a mountain of solid granite. So I worked there. I went to training at Schriever Air Force Base for space and missile surveillance, so detecting missile and space launches from around the planet and running a crew of airmen, Marines, sailors, and soldiers, and Canadian Forces members doing missile warning and missile detection. So anything bigger, brighter than a bottle rocket that would be launched from this planet, we would detect via a series of space-based sensors as well as ground-based sensors around the world, and be able to detect, hey, is this a threat to us or our Canadian friends? Is it a threat to any of our allies? Is it a a threat to anyone, and if so, through the State Department or through other diplomatic means or military agreements like NATO agreement, et cetera, do we notify and tell them, and when do we notify and tell them? So you would see when other nations do a ballistic missile test launch, you'd see that, or submarine launched ballistic missile test, when they do space launches. And as part of the START Strategic Arms Reduction Talks treaty between us and the Russian Federation, we would notify each other. We, by law or by treaty, have to notify each other when we're doing a missile test. Hey, we're doing a missile test in this window, because you want to prevent the accidental start of nuclear war. And space launches, we would notify each other of space launches, et cetera. However, both military and commercial entities launch things. So when you launch something, when either we or another country would launch something, you assess, okay, what is it? Well, certainly if it's an American or Allied launch, you usually know what it is, but it could be your ComSat from another country. And if it's a foreign launch, when it goes up there, you want to make sure, okay, what's that doing up there? They say it's a commercial satellite for, satellite radio. Is it truly that? And there's a variety of folks and sensors and techniques in the Space Surveillance Center that would be like, okay, yeah, it is what they say it is. But the primary role is the Missile Warning Center was to prevent, to detect and assess, evaluate, and advise of missile attacks, primarily against North America or any friendly forces. So one of the revolutions that came in informational technologies from the Gulf War was that, again, you could detect Scud missiles and you could notify. Well, the technology was great that you know it'd land, okay, it's going to land somewhere in Saudi Arabia. That really doesn't help some guy or gal in Bravo Company of 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment or whatever squadron of the 11th ACR they're in. That doesn't help them. So what they did is they refined informational technology and computer processing, refined it that you could use older Cold War level satellites. You could actually make them see better, if you will, and you would assess the data, and then you could get a visual representation of, hey, instead of this entire part of this country or part of this area, it's going to land right about here. And that was a really good thing, because then you could correspondingly warn folks in that area without everyone in one side of the planet, every Allied or American and Allied service person, okay, you have to go do your mop gear. You didn't have to do that. So we worked 24-hour shifts, not 20-hour shifts, 24 hours a day in shift work, which was, days and swings and mids and all over the world, seeing a variety of things. When the Mir space station re-entered, because you have objects that re-enter, yeah, you see the heat signatures and the things of that, and you assess, is this going to hit a populated area? Is it going to land in the middle of the South Pacific? And you assess and advise that to the commander of NORAD and U.S. Space Command, and he or she, gets with the Pentagon. They bring up big conferences of phones and allied countries and whatnot, and say, okay, here's where we assess this impact of this object is going to be. And then you go from there. We also do air defense and warning, which played a big role on September 11th. So.
Was there any moment from your time there that sticks out as being memorable? Or?
Yes, the Day of Days, which was September 11, 2001 on a Tuesday, when we were the United States Strategic Command, NORAD U.S. Space Command, and we had done this, been on like day 2 or 3 of this big exercise we'd been doing, and it was exercise of missile and space and air threats. And then we'd been on watch since like 0500 Mountain Time, and all of a sudden someone said, oh, the Air Warning Center, which is manned by Americans and Canadians, yeah, we have a report of an aircraft crashing in New York City. And so they're trying to get more information. And then the Northeastern Air Defense Sector says we have possible hijacked aircraft. Well, that brings a whole different thing, because again, no folks thought about hijacking. They didn't think about using an aircraft as a weapon. So then rapidly we suspended the exercise we were doing, and as soon as the second aircraft hit the second tower, we all knew, okay, this is an attack upon North. A defense emergency was declared. They brought up the conference that brings all the principals in. Immediately we did things like started notifying all the air defense sectors. Then you start working with civil authorities to ascertain, okay, how many airplanes are still out there, because people didn't know. Because remember, all the air defense radars, all the air surveillance radars are geared externally. You rely on air traffic radars inside the borders of the continental United States and Canada. And transponders. Well, if bad people turn off the transponders, you really don't know where those airplanes are, do you? Unless they pass nearby an airport. And so the terrorists who had done that pretty much woke everyone up that, yes, there is an attack upon the United States. So then there was a change in the defense condition for the United States. There was an air defense emergency, and 2 things immediately happened. They implemented SCATANA, which is a procedure designed for the Cold War but worked magnificently here, that you ground all civil aviation in this country and in the approaches to this country. You either make them turn back or you divert them somewhere else. So they implemented that. And there's about 8,000 flights a day at that time that come in and out of our airspace, both ours and the Canadians. Well, okay, how do you tell 4,000 airplanes you got to go somewhere else or land immediately? That was part of it. The second part was you didn't know how big the threat was. So you immediately start calling to all the air defense units and all the air refueling units and saying, how many planes can you put up? Recall, if you're an Air National Guard or Air Reserve unit, recall your people immediately. How many, what's your status on weapons? And so it was a big thing. So that was the day of days. I got a momentary call to my wife, said I won't be home. She said, I know. I spent that whole day from 05 till almost 5 o'clock the next morning inside Cheyenne Mountain, buttoned up. All the security forces folks were all, lathered up and geared up, and I mean, full battle rattle. The folks at Fort Carson were down, down at the bottom of the mountain. They were getting recalled. It was an interesting day of days. But when I left that next day, the only sound you heard in the skies of America were American and Canadian fighter aircraft, air refueling aircraft, and command and control aircraft. And that changed a lot of the way we did things. Whereas before, the air defense sectors kind of talked to the Federal Aviation Administration and the Canadian counterparts. Now there was an FAA representative inside Cheyenne Mountain. And now you had every piece of critical infrastructure, every dam, every tall building above a certain height, every nuclear reactor, every key interest point. So a couple months later, when we have the Super Bowl, you're really ratcheted up for all sorts of air defense and other threats. So that was like the day of days. Also, my wife had just given birth to our first child about 6 months earlier. So you knew then the world had changed. How it changed. It was much more dramatic than at the end of the Cold War. Now you knew, okay, there is an enemy out there. And this is before resurgent Russia and an emerging China. Which China had been emerging a bit because we had the whole incident with the EP-8 Ares surveillance plane being forced, crashed into by a Chinese fighter, had to land on Hainan Island, and that whole thing had happened in spring of 2001. So you knew, okay, there's an emerging Chinese economic base and a military power rapidly rising. It's before Putin, so you didn't know the Russians were re-emerging. But then you realize all of a sudden, holy cow, the world has changed, and how are we going to meet this new threat? Is there a terrorist behind every tree? Well, no, obviously there's not. How are our friends and allies in the world going to respond? And they did overwhelmingly respond positively. However, now it's like, okay, what's this going to turn into? It's not conventional operations. It's not what now we would call hybrid operations, which the Russians, started to do in Georgia in 2008. But it was a change, and you understood that big nation power still existed, but there are other threats that are less well defined and require a whole of government and allied approach. You have to work with your partner nations, and even people you might not like in the geopolitical sense. You want to get along because sometimes they face the same or similar threats. So that was the day of days. And after that, everything was geared towards, okay, how do you fight this new threat? How do you adapt and become agile and innovative to go get the folks who did this, prevent it from happening again, and not so much will the nation and our way of life succeed, but how do you combat an idea? Similar yet different to the Cold War, which was a war of ideas, freedom and individual expression versus state-run of everything and oppression. Well, this is a different type of oppression and tyranny in that certain groups within in the world felt that if you didn't, even with their own sphere of influence or their own part of the world, if you even talked to the West, you were an apostate. If you did this, you were clearly, this is not the vision of our particular religion or even our geopolitical bent. And clearly there are a whole bunch of other people of that same part of the world, same religious faith or ones near it, who would be like, no, that's not quite right. So you saw a change, and then how are you going to adapt to do it? And some of that had started. Secretary Rumsfeld, hate him or love him, he was in the early 70s, he was the youngest Secretary of Defense. by the early 2000s, he was the oldest. He had been arguing with the services, okay, you need to transform, still need to protect against the high-end threat of nation states, but you need to be more agile and innovative. And all the services resisted that. But now it became more urgent. And how do you adapt? And that was, I would say, that was the defining moment of my time in Colorado Springs, the day of days, and then the subsequent aftermath.
So how was it adapting to this new?
Well, I was right after I left. Colorado Springs in 2002. I'd been selected to go to Staff College through a competitive process. So I went down to the Air Command Staff College in lovely Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. And I saw a lot of guys and gals, and some of them had some wartime experience, but a lot of us had had that whole middle of the 90s, the Cold War's over. Some guys and gals had Persian Gulf in theater experience, but not a lot. A lot of them had, hey, I've been to the desert before, because the Marines and the Army had left in the right after the Persian Gulf War. The Army kept a brigade in Kuwait. The Marines would have a rotational force, but the Air Force for Northern Watch and Southern Watch had stayed in the Middle East ever since that 2 August 1990 date. Well, now you're like, okay, well, how are we going to adapt? We have no friends or neighbors in Afghanistan, and we're still doing the Northern Watch, Southern Watch thing. And this is before Iraqi freedom and the Iraq War kicked off. So a lot of guys and gals had a limited amount of experience, but we all knew something had changed. Okay, how are you going to defeat transnational terrorism? How are you going to defeat radical terrorism, and how do you defeat that idea? And you do nation building, because some of the guys and gals from the Army and the Air Force had been in Bosnia, and we had a fair amount of folks who served in both Allied force and deliberate force. Because as you know, in the 1990s, you had the Bosnian War that ended here in Dayton with the Dayton Peace Accords, but then there were other things going on. So when the Serbs were prosecuting a conflict against Kosovar Albanians, and then you had Kosovo. And it was a big joint coalition air campaign. And so folks had experience with that, but then afterwards folks had experience with, especially the Marines and soldiers, well, it's nation building. Well, no, you're setting the conditions so folks can have a better way of life, so they can get back to a sense of normalcy. Granted, whereas Yugoslavia had Croats, Bosnians, and Muslims all living together, and then had a brutal civil war, and there were some folks moving about here and there. You had folks who learned lessons from that on, okay, well, here's how you set the conditions for security. Here's how you set the ability and make a whole of government approach. Because military, we can do a lot of great things, but there's things in the diplomatic, the informational, the economic parts of national power. Where's the rest of our governments doing this? So we discussed a lot about that, of how do you fight a regular warfare. There were some lessons that were relearned, and that we didn't really even relearn them until after I graduated and gone on to do a couple other things. When I went back there to teach, that's when we really started talking about counterinsurgency strategy with the FM 3-24 and the Marine Corps manual on counterinsurgency, and then how would you use air power in a counterinsurgency to support land and maritime operations, and how would you use air power to do that counterinsurgency thing. But that was all prior to that. So we focused on, okay, the Cold War's over, what does that really mean? How do we work with other nations to help get rid of bad actors in neighborhoods? Because Slobodan Milosevic was a bad actor in his neighborhood. 200,000 Croats, Serbs, and Muslims had been killed, and Bosnians had been killed, and Europe didn't do a whole lot until NATO stepped in. There are other parts of the world, the Rwandan genocide and things like that, where you had seen where when bad people are allowed to ferment, they will. And so how do you do those transnational, irregular type threats, understanding there's an emerging China, there's a new guy in Russia named Putin who says he wants to go back to Russian type of nationalism. So we studied a lot of that, and I was hoping to go to United States Central Command or go to the Air Staff, but because of my background in missiles and space and nuclear command and control and planning, they sent me to Omaha, Nebraska to go to the United States Strategic Command, which was responsible for not only the nuclear forces, but also part of the restructuring after the 9/11 was U.S. Space Command went away and Northern Command stood up, because there was no geographic combatant command for combat in North America. That being that the attack against North America, you'd call, Fleet Forces Command, or you'd call, First Army, but there was no joint combatant command with a 4-star guy or gal in charge of working with all the civil agencies and all the intelligence agencies. And that was one of the things you learned from 9/11, is that everyone talking, certain folks in the intelligence community all had a piece of the puzzle, but they wouldn't talk to each other. Almost like the joint debate they had a decade earlier with the services and joint. And then the military talking to the Department of State, the Department of the Interior, Department of Commerce. And then they stood up the Department of Homeland Security, which is an amalgamation of law enforcement and government agencies. And then they also stood up Northern Command, which was a military command of all 4 services, working with NORAD, working with the Canadians and whatnot. So I wanted to go to the Pentagon, but they sent me to Strategic Command to be a watch officer with space operations. So we would do things like, you'd get, our friends in U.S. Central Command would call, and they would call up and say, hey, we have some joint special operations task forces doing certain things in this part of the world. Hey, could you optimize the GPS constellation? So basically, GPS is a series of ones and zeros set with a very precise timing signal with a certain amount of satellites and 6 planes of separation around the planet. And it gives you your time, your location, lat and long, and your elevation. Well, there's ways you can optimize that system to get really within a certain degree of, hey, this is exactly where you are on this planet in every aspect, in all 3 dimensions. So, folks from U.S. Central Command or U.S. Special Operations Command say, hey, can you optimize the satellites? So we generate the op order and direct the forces to, okay, we need you to do this, this, and this. And that was really rewarding in that you had an effect on the mission using strategic systems, doing all those things you were doing before, but now optimizing for the fight. So you would, hey, we're going to be doing these type of operations. There's a lot of certain activity here. Can you assess it and analyze it? Okay, that's rocket launches from here, here, and here, and then relaying that to the combatant commanders in CENTCOM and SOCOM, and then they'd go take care of those type of things. That was really rewarding, and it was interesting being in Omaha because it was the former head of the former base at the Strategic Air Command. So you still had the nuclear mission, but now you had space, and then you had the emerging aspect of cyber. Folks would talk about information operations. Now we call it military information support operations, but info ops started becoming a bigger thing, and cyber before cyber was, I don't want to say cool, before it was prevalent. Now we think about cyber threats and hacking, all that all the time. There, in the early 2000s, you really didn't think a lot about that. You thought a little about it. You watched the War Games movie with Matthew Broderick hacking into the system, and you saw Sneakers with Robert Redford and Sidney Poitier, how they got into computer systems, but even those were nascent compared to the emerging technologies that were coming out 2004, 5, 6 with the iPhone and Apple technology and Samsung and all those other things, and just that rapid exponential growth in information processing. So cyber and information ops became a big thing. And then how do you do that legally as a nation? Is it an act of war if you prevent something from happening or cause something to happen? And what are the authorities, both legal and ethical, moral, and legal? What are the legal authorities under law of armed conflict? Can you do certain things? And then also it was also coordination of space operations to assist the forces in by that time the Iraq War had kicked off. So forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, assisting them in doing their mission, with everything from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, optimizing those systems, space-based systems, as well as the navigation and timing and warning systems. So that I started doing a little bit of that, and I was a watch officer in charge of a team of about a dozen airmen, Marine soldiers, and sailors for a while. And then I got fleeted up to be a strike advisor aboard Looking Glass. And Looking Glass is an aircraft that came about in the height of the Cold War in 1961-62. Originally a mission run by the Air Force. It was an EC-135 where you'd always have one airborne all the time. And they called it Looking Glass because it could mirror the nuclear command and control capabilities of the then Strategic Air Command command center. So God forbid if there was a nuclear war, you would have a survivable, redundant capability to control. That sounds kind of oxymoronish to how can you control a nuclear war, but to provide message capability for the President and the Secretary of Defense. that you'd be able to get messages back and forth to the forces and control the missiles and the bombers and the rear refueling planes. Well, that mission remained throughout the 90s, even after the Cold War. It changed a bit in that, in the spirit of jointness, the Air Force devolved itself of the EC-135s, because it was an Air Force, primarily Air Force crew. Well, then it became manned aboard the Navy, which had the take charge and move out aircraft, which would talk to ballistic missile submarines. You know, the Strategic Command said, why don't we combine this? So what you did is you had a Navy airplane, the E-6B Mercury, that could have the ability to talk to fleet ballistic missile submarines from, you know, positions around the CONUS, go out and fly over the ocean. But then you reconfigured the airplane internally so you could put a joint battle staff on there. So you'd have a flag or general officer flying with you, and you had the ability to command and control the nuclear forces of the nation, as well as some of the space forces. But you also had a backup capability to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, earlier I mentioned how the missiles are controlled by launch control centers and they're all spread out. But if they were destroyed in some way, shape, or form, the requirement from the 60s on was to have a redundant, capable way of launching them. So I was like an airborne missileer as well as an ops team chief, where we'd tell the air crew where to go, where to fly, and you were almost like the old days of strategic alert. For a week at a time, I lived in a hardened, semi-underground alert facility. You know, the horn would blow, you run to the airplane and do practice exercises and whatnot. I did that for 2.5 years, flying all over, a variety of, pulling alert at a variety of locations. Always, you know, I had a flag or general officer with us, with the codes and all the things you need to do that should the president want. And that was interesting because it was like almost like a flash back to the Cold War. It was still a necessary capability, but it was good duty because you're doing something important again. It wasn't very applicable to the war on terror and the counterinsurgency, but still at that high end of combat operations, it was interesting to be back in that environment again. So from there, I served 3 years in Omaha, and from there and got selected for a lieutenant colonel. And then I went back to staff college to teach and instruct in joint warfare, because I'd already done 2 joint assignments, 2 joint tours, one at NORAD U.S. Space Command in Colorado Springs and one at Strategic Command. I knew how the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force all worked together, and our Canadian forces and NATO allies. So I went down there to teach. And that was personally, was greatly rewarding. Professionally, not so much. But I taught at the Air Command Staff College. I taught leadership and strategy, national security policy, and taught joint warfare, as well as adjuncting over at the Air War College, teaching joint aspects of space operations. But one of the key things there was that I volunteered to get trained in air operations and joint air operations. One of my big qualms was that, you know, the fight's going on and I'm here in Alabama. So I petitioned my brigadier general, the commandant of Air Command Staff College, a guy named General J. Lindell. And he had been an interesting guy in that he flew in the F-111 raid in 1986. He had got a Silver Star in the Persian Gulf War. He was a F-16 pilot then, for flying a Mondo, you know, duration 8-hour F-16 mission. Fighters usually fly 1.5 hours to 2 hours. He flew an 8-hour mission with 3 air refuelings, protecting an ODA, an Operation Detachment Alpha Special Forces, Army Special Forces team in Iraq during the Persian Gulf War. He had the heart of a warrior and been around, and he really liked the fact that guys and gals wanted to go deploy. And I'm like, well, heck yeah, I want to go to the show. So I went down to Hurlburt Field and got trained up, and I taught it, just actual doing it, planning the air portion of a joint campaign, working with the Joint Force Air Component Commander, the guy or gal who's the air boss for the overall CENTCOM commander in theater. So we worked with the Army Battlefield Coordination Detachment. We worked with the Marine Liaison Officers and the NAIL, the Naval Air Liaison. And pretty much we did the joint campaign, and it was right during the surge, and that's also made it important. Now Secretary Mattis and then General Petraeus and a whole bunch of guys and gals had come up with the fact that, you know, we knew counterinsurgency. We were great at it. The Marines had been doing small wars from the 1919 time frame all the way up to the early 1940s. They even had a small wars manual from 1940. And the Army became great at counterinsurgency. It just took them about 7 years to do it. So by 1971-72, the Army knew counterinsurgency, as did the Marines. But then we left Vietnam and forgot all about that, went back to the Cold War threat of the 80s and 90s, 70s and 80s. So when they came out with the counterinsurgency doctrine, there were a group of us who really took it, and one of my mentors was a guy named Dr. Bill Dean, and he and Dr. Jeff Riley were proponents of air power in small wars. And so I got to go teach a seminar of guys and gals, of majors and lieutenant commanders, who we were training them. Here's how you use air power in small wars. And I didn't say Air Force air power, any air power: Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, civilian, other governmental agencies. And so we taught how to use air power in small wars and counterinsurgency aspects therein. And Jeff Riley, who had been a private in Vietnam, and then eventually retired as lieutenant colonel, got his PhD from University of Alabama as a professor of military science there. He had seen counterinsurgency the first time, and he was great at the operational art and maneuver. So we had a seminar where we taught it was interesting. I taught air commandos. I had a couple Army Special Forces leaders. I had a Navy Special Boat unit individual. I had some folks from the Philippines who actually fought in their own counterinsurgency in the Philippines, in the southern part of the Philippines. They've been fighting forever. And so it was really interesting to do that. So went down to Hurlburt Field, got trained up, and then went to the Joint Air and Space Operations Center in Southwest Asia. And there you saw it up close, not as up close and personal as being in Iraq or Afghanistan, but you saw it because you had a command center that every time that you heard tick, troops in contact, on the ops floor, everything in that part of the world, okay, we're going to get as much air power, whether it's rotary wing or fixed wing, to that portion as quickly as possible. So we developed the air plan, the air campaign portion of the joint plan, that is, over that. And that was really resonating to me, because for 5 months and 28 days, I got to work with my coalition and sister service partners. And it was really cool because you could really make a difference. Moving some airplanes here or there, making sure these folks got resupped. Hey, can we do an airdrop in this part of RC East? Well, yeah, that's important to those guys and gals out there. Yeah, you need to start thinking that way. And then I came back and maybe a better instructor, a better graduate school instructor for the Air Force and for the nation. I really took a liking to it. So after that, I was going to go into the PhD program and do that. But then the opportunity came to go be a combat support group, mission support group deputy and commander in Georgia, the state, not the country. And so I went over to PCS, to Robins Air Base, and there they had the J-STARS unit, the Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, an E-8C Boeing 707 airplane that was sort of like an airborne warning control station, but for the land. It was a combined Air Force Army team in the back of the airplane, and it had a radar that scanned the land environment. It was first used in the Gulf War in a very experimental way, but it could track land activity, and it really helped out for the Marine and Army land component folks, because you can track vehicles. And it was designed again for a Cold War thing, but they'd make it upgrade so you can use it in counterinsurgency. And it'd be that whole network that advises the guys and gals on the ground, hey, there's vehicles coming from this azimuth and whatnot. So I was the mission support group commander for the active duty side, because it was a blended unit, had Air National Guard and Air Force active duty. So from there I volunteered to go to Iraq and lead airmen, because it's an armed force. You want to go to the show. And so I went to some training, and then went to Talil, which is near Nasiriyah in the southern part of Iraq. Is called Ali Air Base, as the deputy commander of the 407th Air Expeditionary Group. And the Air Expeditionary Group was a group, larger than battalion, smaller than brigade sized unit that ran the airfield and all the operations in that part of southern Iraq. Fortuitously, we were assigned at a base that was also part of Cobb Adder. So you had the brigade headquarters for the 4-1 armored, or 4-1 Cav, and the 4-1 armored came in and they did a RIPTOA and all that. So you had battalions out all over the southern part of Iraq, in the 4 provinces there. And you had a lot of our airmen were JTACs, or Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, Air Liaison Officers, Tactical Air Control Parties. They were embedded with Army companies and Army battalions and whatnot. And then we also had our explosive ordnance disposal technicians out at the patrol bases and out at the patrol bases and some of the FOBs. And so we were responsible for them all, and responsible for air and space activities. So it was more than just running the airfield. It was liaising with our Army brothers and sisters and our whole of government friends there. So we had like Department of State, we had Department of Commerce folks, we had Iraqi Army folks there, we had some Australians, we had Navy, we had a few Marines where we were at. And so you ran the airfield, you did patrols, you did joint logistics movements up, up the highway towards Baghdad, and the resupply and support of the Army companies out on, like, patrol base Shalat, which is like 3 kilometers from the Iranian border. And you had 3 airmen out there, and about a fair amount of Army soldiers and Iraqi soldiers. And it was it was near the Ziggurat of Ur, which is a 4,300-year-old pre-Babylonian artifact, a big, huge pyramid-like structure. It was northwest of Basra, right near Nasiriyah. So you're at the city of Ur, which is in the Bible. It's the birthplace of Abraham. It's where Abraham the prophet was from. And so you see all that history and whatnot, as well as you're doing good things. I mean, we had our firefighters, for example. Our firefighters and logisticians would get with the Nasiriyah Fire Department, and there had been a whole bunch of efforts from fire departments in the United States to give these guys more equipment, because a lot of the equipment they had worn out or been destroyed or confiscated by Saddam Hussein's regime, and you're just helping them fight fires, because Nasiriyah has over 100,000 people in it. Just doing that joint air advise and assist type mission, because the brigades that were there and their respective battalions and companies, they transitioned obviously from combat ops to advise and assist. So advising your Iraqi counterparts. A guy I went to Air Command Staff College with, who had also been a missileer at one point, he transferred to a training squadron. He was a training squadron second in command, and he was in charge of a joint logistics trading team. So they'd go out in their big, huge MRAPs and help the Iraqi forces do logistics. And hey, here's things to think about. And the way you were taught under the Saddam regime and the Soviet method doesn't quite work as well as what you needed to do for your nation. And we would show them a way, not necessarily the American way. And that was very rewarding in that you met folks from the fellow services and coalition, but you also met Iraqis who were pretty glad you were there, would like you to go eventually, but they have a big neighbor next door called Iran, which they fought a bloody war from 1980 to 88, lost 400,000 people each. And they were understanding that, okay, Saddam's gone, okay, now what? You have the Sunni Shia government trying to work a coalition type of government. You have Shia influence from Iran. They understand their role in history. They also understood their neighborhood, and they understood that the neighborhood can be tough, and so trying to build them back up so they could have a semblance of normalcy. And it's really hard because they're in a post-Saddam regime, and they're finding their way. And you want to teach them a way, not necessarily the Western way, but you want to give them the tools. Again, the whole point of counterinsurgency, the military and counterinsurgency, is set the conditions for that friendly government, should they want to do so, take care of their citizens. And that was really rewarding, because you were doing, we had Predators there, we had P-3 Orions, we had Army Aviation, working with my sister services, and that was fantastic. That was the highlight of my career, because I was in the fight, I was doing good things, working with brothers and sisters. The only bad part of it was having to do the dignified remains ceremonies. Unfortunately, we had about a dozen soldiers who were still getting killed by IEDs, not nearly as much, but IEDs, EFPs, enhanced form penetrators, and that was not fun. I wrote an article for it from the Ohio State Alumni Magazine saying, folks, do you understand what's going on out here with the young guys and gals who are working really, really hard to make it better for this part of the world, and how important it is to get it right. So, but that was the highlight of my career. I returned back to Georgia. From there, a PCS to Norfolk, Chesapeake, Virginia, Norfolk and Suffolk, Virginia, part of a joint deployment team. Because by then, I knew I was going to be a lieutenant colonel. I knew I was going to be a colonel because I had danced around. The Air Force is squirrely in that it doesn't matter how good of a leader you are, your community, your MOS. Think of it as your branch in the military, or your branch in the Army, or your community in the Navy, what they would call it. You're either an Airedale, you're a submariner, or you're surface warfare in the Navy. Or what branch? Are you in artillery, infantry? Are you combat service support versus combat? The infantry, the armored and armored cav, aviation. So that's really prevalent in the Air Force. So I decided, well, I really enjoy what I'm doing. So I'll do one more assignment with deployments. So I volunteered for a joint deployment team. One of the things that General Mattis had done when he was the Joint Forces Command commander was he stood up a thing called the Joint Enabling Capabilities Command. It was a bunch of guys and gals from all 4 services, 1/3 active, 2/3 reserve, where you'd go out and solve problems. And you were experts in operational and strategic level planning. So we would go and solve problems. We do exercises and war games, but also real world planning. We had folks who had been to Afghanistan 2-3 times for 6 months at a time, including reservists. And so I signed on with them, and I moved there in 2010. And then my first thing was Pakistan. In the fall, Pakistan fighting counterinsurgency in the northwest part of the country, but also in the fall, summer and fall of 2010, they had massive rains. 15%, 20% of the country is underwater. Some of it only 4 inches, some of it 8 feet underwater, bridges. So the government of Pakistan asked the Americans and a variety of other nations to come and help. So went there in September of 2010, went to Islamabad, Pakistan, to the American embassy, worked with a joint task force-like structure called Office of Defense Rep Pakistan, which was a JTF-like structure put in place by General Mattis now that he was the CENTCOM commander. They had a 3-star Navy admiral there, a vice admiral. And basically, we would help the Pakistanis do counterinsurgency, whole of government, secure the logistics into Pakistan, or into Afghanistan, because, as you know, Afghanistan's a landlocked country, so the easiest way to move something is maritime. Second easiest is by road or rail. Not a lot of trains in Pakistan. So through the Tokar Gate or through the Torkham Gate and through the Khyber Gate, you had land convoys of stuff going. So we organized that, but also there for the floods. So we brought a battalion of Army aviation from Fort Richardson, Alaska. We brought the aviation component, aviation element of the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit ashore from out in the Gulf, or out in the Arabian Sea. So we had Marines in the south, we had Army in the north, and we were planning with ourselves as well as other nations and the Pakistanis the redistribution of humanitarian aid and assistance. So we did that for 4 months and got to see some wonderful things and cool things, and then rotated back when the floods were pretty much over. The Pakistanis had asked us to leave, but you saw some interesting things in Pakistan. Being at the embassy was interesting, but also seeing the interaction, the whole of government approach, working with other government agencies like the Department of State or the Department of Justice, as well as with host nation. General Kayani is sort of like the FEMA director. He's a retired Pakistani general who's like the FEMA director for the government of Pakistan. And they truly appreciated the help. Of course, that time we didn't know that, 5 months later, 30 miles north of where we all sit, and Osama bin Laden would be killed by Night Stalkers from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment and Naval Special Warfare professionals. But that was interesting because you got to see another culture in another part of the world, work in a joint coalition environment. Rotated back from that, did some joint exercises, and then in February of 2011, again, part of that joint deployment team, hey, we're going to Libya or Libyan coast. What for? Oh, it's going to be a non-combatant evacuation operation. There's some bad things going on in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, who had been abiding by our sanctions, everything we asked him to do with regards to weapons of mass destruction, he's killing some of his own people. Let's go and help out and do a non-combatant evacuation operation. So with like 48 hours of mourning, part of being on a joint deployment team, went to went to Frankfurt, Germany, down to Stuttgart to AFRICOM headquarters. Decision was made to stand up a joint task force under AFRICOM, under General Carter Ham, the AFRICOM commander. They stood up a joint task force. We went down to Naples to NSA Capodichino, stayed there for a couple of days, went up to Gaeta, embarked upon the USS Mount Whitney, which is the Sixth Fleet flagship, but also the NAV Euro, NAV Africa. Stood up a joint task force called Joint Task Force Odyssey Dawn, and went to sea with the idea that we're going to do a non-combatant evacuation operation, turned into combat operations, and then we coordinated all that for the primarily air and maritime campaign that, within a month and a half, less than a month actually, had eradicated the Libyan Air Force, the Libyan Navy, had some joint partners on the ground, some host nation partners and some other governmental agencies who had allies in Libyan, the Libyan movement to overthrow Gaddafi, and set into some set into place some conditions where we made the bad man go away. We turned it over to NATO as Operation Unified Protector, and then NATO had it for a while. And then again, once more, the military solution is over. State Department, Commerce Department, all these other agencies try and do that. And the State Department had some issues with that. You see, a little year later in Benghazi, the attack on Ambassador Stevens and those 3 other professionals. So that was interesting being part of that, because now you don't know, okay, we made the bad man go away. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends, doesn't it? So, and then after that, after Libya, went to Colombia and helped out with, again, assessing a whole-of-government approach where the Colombian government, who had been fighting a counterinsurgency for 50 years against the Fuerza Revolucionaria de Colombia, the FARC, they had beat them militarily, but they wanted to learn from the American experience of, okay, you defeated the guerrillas, you defeated the insurgents, now what? Well, now you work together to get your Department of Agriculture in there to those hinterlands to help your own citizens, and who want and need help, and you're willing to help them. But you've set the conditions for success. The Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice. How do you resolve? You've come to a military solution. How do you get the peace process? How do you help those countrymen of yours? So we helped them do that and talked about myself and 2 other individuals, a Navy guy and an Army guy, went down there and talked about a whole of government approach and helped them, hey, here's our experience, here's a way to do it. And they were experts in counterinsurgency, and they had done a great study, but it was almost a symposium, several weeks of, okay, the Deputy Minister of Defense, Deputy Minister of the Interior, okay, well, what are some ways to do it? And it was almost like a way that we came up with a plan and shared our experiences, understanding the cultural differences of how they would do it. And that was really awesome being in Colombia. Again, another continent, another joint coalition environment, and not just the military solution, but an interagency, whole-of-government, multinational solution of, okay, here's a way that may work for you. How can you make it better for your citizens? Because when citizens have it better in their own country, they're less likely to do other things in other countries. So, and then returned back to Ohio after that, was a detachment commander and professor of airspace studies for Air Force ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, here at Wright State University, and also with the University of Dayton and Cedarville, generating a new generation of leaders, parlaying my experience across the spectrum of conflict on 5 of the 7 continents, trying to get better leaders for the services and for the nation. I did a lot of joint work with my friends here at Wright State University Army ROTC and University of Dayton Army ROTC, teaching the young future leaders that, hey, you're going to be working in a multi-service, multinational, interagency environment. How can you best lead airmen, Marines, soldiers, and sailors in that environment? And I was really proud of that, and then transferred over to Air Force Materiel Command as the Chief of Strategic Planning. Basically, the forces and equipment we're going to, and systems and capabilities we're going to buy over the next 20 to 40 years, did some of that, and then I mustered out, retired, had a wonderful ceremony, and ended up here on Civvy Street, working in the Department of Defense and Department of the Air Force.
Wow.
Sorry about that.
No,
it's a long diatribe.
No, you have an impressive military history, and that's.
Well, proud to serve. Do it again.
Well, I only have one question for you in our last 5 minutes. What message would you like to leave for future generations who review this interview?
Well, there's a couple I'd like to leave. The foremost one is that the nation we serve and the Constitution we've all sworn to uphold and defend is a living document. It's worth, it goes beyond politicians. It goes beyond personalities of our judicial, legislative, and executive branches. It sets the foundation, again, the conditions for success. It's just up to individual Americans to achieve that success. But that success comes at a price. It comes at a price in blood and treasure, in that the freedom is worth fighting for, and it comes at great cost. But it has to be the willingness of Americans to fight for it, and not just in the military services, being better citizens, neighbors, parish members, church, mosque, synagogue, or if you believe, community, a community that works together towards that common goal of making it better. With regards to the defense of the republic, there's a quote by Ronald Reagan that often gets used, but not probably enough, is that, and it's true. Our forefathers and the founding fathers, they believed it and they understood it. But more so now than ever, it's true. that, the freedoms that we have don't just come. We don't pass along the freedoms we have. It's not natural in the state of existence. It doesn't come down through the bloodstream. It's not in our DNA to just have this freedom. It needs to be protected and fought for, and it's one of those things that folks don't understand, that every generation has to step up. Whether you think the Cold War's over and peace is just breaking out everywhere in the world or not, you need to step up. And freedom just doesn't happen. You have to pass down the understanding that the freedoms we have and we cherish need to be maintained. And sometimes that involves sacrifice, whether at home or abroad. But it just doesn't happen. Freedom itself is only, in the way Ronald Reagan kind of said it, was that freedom is only one generation away from extinction. One generation away. It doesn't sustain itself. It has to be fought for, protected. And how you do that is, up to that future generation. But it's worth fighting for. If you've seen different government systems, you've seen other cultures. Ours isn't the end-all, be-all. But the freedoms we have are the envy of the world in a lot of ways, not every way. And it does have its downsides, but it has to be fought for and protected. And it's not just the veteran; it's the school teacher, it's the business person, it's the worker, it's the social worker, it's the educator. All those folks have to fight for it in their own way. But when it comes time where all other options fail, every diplomatic and everything, you may have to take up arms and fight against another nation state or a group of individuals who seek to eradicate that way of life. And it's worth doing. It's absolutely worth doing. When you go around the world, you see different cultures and whatnot, and you see the freedoms that we have, and you see freedoms that other people have as well as the oppression. We're truly blessed. It's just a matter of fighting for that to sustain it, because over time it has proven to be the best environment. The things we cherish and the things we hold dear, and again, that living document has set the conditions for success. Whether or not individuals have that success or not, at least they have the freedom to succeed or fail and learn from that failure. And that needs to be fought for and protected. That'd be the best way I'd tell future generations about that.
Well, this concludes our interview. And I'd just like to say thank you for taking the time to do this interview.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you as well, man.